Good evening, everyone. My name is A.B. Timothy, and I am your host of the Keeping the Beacon Lit weekly podcast. The goal of this podcast is to keep the creative beacon lit inside the hearts of authors and creatives and artists generally. So, my goal is to encourage you to keep writing, to keep creating art, to keep doing what makes you you. I think everyone should pursue something creative. We were created by a creative God. So to be his image and to fulfill his image, we should be creating things ourselves and flexing those muscles, as it were. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the idea of magic, and magic specifically in the context of world systems. Now, what that means, I'll get into here in a little bit, but it should be fun. Before we get into the nitty gritty of magic in world systems, I wanted to take a chance and thank all of my Kickstarting supporters. As you know, I am an author of the upcoming fantasy novel, The Shards of Arthur's Shield, which is an Arthurian inspired story taking place about 400 years after Arthur went into the West. And currently, the Kickstarter is live, which you'll find as the first link in the description below. If you're watching this after the fact, that's where you'll find it. If you're watching it live on X, you can find the link to the Kickstarter via my link tree in my bio here on X. So go check that out if you haven't already. But part of the reward structure for supporting me on Kickstarter is you get a shout out here on the podcast. So I'm just going to quickly read through many of these names and thank them for their contribution to my work and to helping keeping my beacon lit, as it were. So thank you to Mike, Chani Hawkinson, Trinity Cunningham, Richard, Kimberly Carson, Sue Lamberson, Captain Bojangles, Amber Davis, Don Davis, Yamato, Harry, Merg, Isle, Jason Wells, Aaron Davies, Greg Cooper, Tony Garcia, Mista Mac, Amber Davis, Mark Evanson, Elliot Kleinschmidt, and Schwambly Tibble. You all have made my beacon a bit brighter by supporting my creative endeavors and having now pre-ordered over 30 copies of The Shards of Arthur's Shield. Again, link in the description or show notes below. So let's get into it. I'm a fantasy author and I write magic systems. I write stories with characters who use magic. And oftentimes, as a Christian, especially as a Christian author, I get asked, well, how do you define magic? Because doesn't, the Bible preclude us from, engaging with magic and utilizing those aspects in our stories? I would, of course, argue no, because the Bible itself includes a lot of magic, good magic. The word magic itself, if it's used in Scripture, I can't recall if it is not given the best rap. The names of the wielders that we have today, the wizards, the witches, these sorcerers, these are things strictly condemned in the annals of Scripture. Thus, as a fantasy author, I struggle to be God honoring. As a Christian fantasy author, I should say, I struggle to be God honoring in my use of magical systems and magical devices in my story. However, I then look at scripture to find my inspiration. So let's define what I mean by magic. Magic, as I would argue, is anything that defies the ordinary, that surpasses, if you will, the average, the standard. I believe one of my forebears in the ethereal realm described magic as any sufficiently advanced technology, and perhaps that could be true, but perhaps there's also something to be said for literal, supernatural objects. Let's look at scripture if we shall. In scripture, we see references to things like the Ark of the Covenant as sort of the biggest example. Moses' staff that he uses to face off against the priests of Egypt and their snakes, and Moses and his snake, otherwise known as his staff, beats them. We see Moses himself. Some would argue Moses is some kind of druid almost, but in truth, we know that that's not technically true because druids worship earth spirits, whereas Moses worshipped the one true God of Israel. So he was more of a cleric, technically speaking. It just so happened that the domain of his God was all things. Magic, when used righteously, like most other things that are typically taboo, is not something to be ashamed of. So that's what magic is. Magic is the supernatural powers utilized by characters to circumvent situations or to solve problems. Now, something else we have to define is world systems. This is magic and world systems. So, what is a world system? Well, a world system as we know it today would be something like the United Nations, the United States government, or the League of Nations, if you want to go back 100 years. Different examples of international or national bodies that are systems in the world. Something that a lot of fantasy, at least more traditional fantasy, kind of doesn't really question or doesn't really ask is how does the implication of magic affect the systems of governance? Now, we have examples like the Wheel of Time, where magic is woven, if you'll forgive the pun, it's woven deeply into the system of governance. In fact, I believe almost every nation in the Wheel of Time, their king or queen has an advisor who is a wielder of the magic system. So it's deeply woven into their world systems, into their courts and their rules and how they go about living in society. They have a central body of magic wielders in the White Tower, which governs the world, some would argue, almost like a cabal. And there's other examples, like in the Arthurian tales, which I'm partial to myself. In the Arthurian tales, we get examples of people like Merlin in the more traditional sense. Merlin is a magic user who uses his magic typically for good and for the betterment of the Britons and his king, that being King Arthur. Magic is something that has been understood as being part of our reality for a long, long time. This is why I believe you don't get grand reactions from people. For example, I'm thinking of the example of King Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. His rule was not dictated by the fact that magic existed, because while magic existed, it was only in the hands of a few, and those few have been known to be able to be overcome. So magic didn't really change his rule very much, but he also didn't, he wasn't shocked by it. He wasn't taken aback by it. It was just part of the world around him. It was natural. So, so too, in much of British history, for example, things like the Fae and these ideas of mystical creatures of the night or mystical creatures even of the daylight, but in the woods, they were simply part of the lore. They were part of the world. They didn't question it. And so kings would rule with the understanding that these things might exist. But did it really affect them? No. Because their interactions with the plane of mortals or the mortal realm were very few and far between. But is that the case in your story? You have to ask yourself the question, what does my world look like? Because if you're building a world where magic is an everyday aspect of life, then there has to be laws governing it. There has to be precedent set in the court system. There has to be kings who rule on the subject of magic in their worlds. In fact, again, in some Arthurian tales, because not every Arthurian tale takes it the same way, Uther Pendragon, father of Arthur Pendragon, had outlawed magic and outlawed wizards, and so Merlin had to live in hiding until he became advisor to Arthur when Arthur rose to the throne of Britain. So ask yourself these questions. When a magic wielding person or a magic user meets a government official, how do they interact? What kinds of butting of heads do they do? Or is there any butting of heads? Does one simply have authority over the other? There could be the example of the Jedi in Star Wars after Order 66. The Jedi would never, well, I shouldn't say never, because there were some knuckleheads, but for the most part, after Order 66 especially, the Jedi wouldn't openly defy the Sith Order or the Order of the New Empire because they wanted to keep their heads. And so there was just an understanding that the civil government was in higher respect or in higher standing at that point than the magic authority. In my own worlds, it varies world to world, story to story, even culture to culture, depending on what world I'm writing in. In the Shards of Arthur's Shield, magic is something that people have just known about. It's sort of not given too much thought because why should it be given thought? Oh, that's just how things are. I haven't, the thought process of many of the characters in the world is, well, I haven't seen much of the world, so perhaps this is just how things are in this part of the world. For example, Thomas, the main character, when he meets the Lady of the River, who's not quite the Lady of the Lake, but related to her, he doesn't question it. He just kind of accepts it. He's like, well, this is okay. This is part of the world now, I suppose. This is something that exists, something that happens. After all, why should he question it? He has no countermanning reality. He doesn't know a reality without that in it. So why should he believe that it shouldn't exist? And so why should it affect him so? Now, you could argue when he approaches a mighty dragon and is forced to combat with the dragon, that could lead to many more questions. But you also have to understand that part of British lore is that Saint George slayed a dragon. And this story has been told to children of Britain for millennia, at least. And so, why would a child of Britain have any fear of a dragon? Or perhaps they would have fear of a dragon, but why would they be aghast at the revelation of a dragon's existence? For example, perhaps you and I go out on an adventure, on a hike, so to speak, and we come across a dragon. We have a an understanding of the world and a perspective that says, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. It's a dragon. Our world doesn't have dragons, at least not anymore, right? We There was a time when we believed there were dragons. So how is this dragon here now? But for someone like Thomas, especially at 16, just leaving his village for the first time in his life, going and adventuring across the great plains and hills of Britain, why should he even give it a second thought? Of course there's dragons. I've been told stories of dragons my whole life. You have to decide for yourself and for your story how that will play out. And if it'll be different for every story. Because, for example, in the book coming out in December of this year, which I'm still workshopping the title, but my current working title is The Student's Symbol, which is a much more high fantasy, magic heavy sort of academia sort of thing. Magic is the bedrock of society outside of the North. So again, this is another British fantasy, so to speak. And so you'll notice some names in this book, like the name of a city called Londinium. Or you might notice some other famous cities like Greenwich in Britain. But the world is very different. Something changed. The timeline is wrong, so to speak. And what you'll notice in the second book, which is slated to come out in May of next year, when you get to the broader world, to the broader society of Britain, magic is every day. And I'm not like just straight up regular old magic. Like these people are summoning spirits to help them clean their house. They're having tournaments to see who can cast the most elaborate, the most fascinating magic display. They are utilizing magic in war as if it's a tool of war. So the question you'll be forced to ask yourself, well, there's a couple of them, is when after you read the first book is, well, why does the North hate magic so much? Because where the main character in that series, Nail, comes from is a place called the Village of Nevercane, which quite literally implies what it means, or means what it implies, which is they are a people who do not believe in the use of magic. They will never again wield the arcane, so never cane. But the the reasons for that, the cultural narratives for why they refuse the arcane, those were put in place hundreds and hundreds of years before Nail. And so he's part of a generation who just asks the question, kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, why? What's wrong with magic? We've all used magic. Well, I shouldn't say we've all used magic, but we've never used magic. So can it really be that bad? We hear stories all the time of people in the South who use magic. So can it be that bad? But as you get into the world systems of that world and see how magic is interwoven with the politics and the religion and the society of that world, you'll begin to fill in the blanks as to why it was outlawed in the North. I won't spoil anything, but it is, if I can, toot my own horn a little bit, it's kind of cool. So think of people in stories like in The Wheel of Time, you have the White Cloaks. In Percy Jackson and the Olympians, you have the Mortals. And think of how these people react to magic being used. It's not a good thing. They don't like it. They think everyone who uses it is either creepy, like the most gracious they'll get is creepy, or they're straight up spawn of the devil, if you're the White Cloaks, for example. And how does that translate then? How does that societal level thinking translate to the higher levels of society in the court systems the in the annals of government, for example. You have to ask yourself as an author, especially if you're writing fantasy. Again, this is a very fantastical sort of podcast. So this episode is so far. Can a magic user walk around very blatantly using magic, or would they be manhandled or othered or ostracized for doing so? You know, D&D has different cities that have different rules about it. Maybe in your world that's the same thing. There's different cities have different rules. There's a city in the Wheel of Time where weaving the one power, or is that right? Yes, weaving the one power is completely forbidden, and to do so is of the highest offense, and you can lose your head for it. And again, they have reasons for that. And again, going back to something I talked about a little bit earlier, magic in world systems in our real world is a touchy subject, because as a Christian, I believe in divine magic, so to speak, divine supernatural ability. I believe in a God who can and does still work miracles. And so that would be considered magic. I've known stories of people who have been prayed over. And I know prayer, faith, healing has its implications, and I won't get into all that here because that's not the point of this show. In our world, magic is taboo, as it should be, because it's forbidden in scripture. But I've known of people who have been prayed over in hospital rooms, and cancer disappears, and paraplegics have walked, and tied tongues have been loosed, and so on and so on and so on. And it's hard to see that as anything else but divine magic, which divine magic is usually called clerical magic, but it's still a form of the supernatural. It's still a realization of a higher, greater truth. Can't speak to anyone else's indie books yet because I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm reading a few right now, and they've got some interesting questions when it comes to magic involved in them. I'll be excited to report on those when I can. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Make sure you go and support the Kickstarter if you're so inclined. If you're interested in being on the show, you'll find a link to that in the description below if you're watching it after the fact. I'd love to have you on. And thank you. Have a great week. And remember, keep the beacon lit.